Earlier today in Canberra, a committee designed to craft an Indigenous voice to Parliament met for the first time. Co-chaired by former member of the Human Rights Commission Tom Calma and prominent Indigenous academic Marsha Langton, it includes also a range of distinguished Australians such as Father Frank Brennan, Noel Pearson and others. When I read about the announcement naming the members of this committee in the newspaper over the weekend, I have to admit I was surprised. You see, I had been told by senior members of the government that there would be no voice to the Parliament, despite the Minister Ken Wyatt's strong support for it in all of its various forms. While many coalition MPs reject the idea of a third chamber of the Parliament, well, Wyatt's been on board from day one. First, when he drafted legislation before the election to create this voice as the Makarrata Commission, legislation that's since been dumped. Later on, when he kept the door open on a referendum in his first speech to the press club after the May election win, and now that he says Australians won't support putting a voice in the Constitution, Ken Wyatt and his committee hope to do it anyway by going around the people and using legislation instead. At the level of first principle, there's an inherent contradiction in any attempt to unite Australians by treating people differently. Indeed, it's the very fallacy at the heart of identity politics, more generally. You don't end discrimination by discriminating, and you don't increase social harmony by defining people by the differences. Now, I'm open to some acknowledgement of Aboriginal people in the Constitution as promised by John Howard in the run-up to the 2007 election and supported by all subsequent governments. But it has to be something that all Australians could unite around. Tony Abbott's idea to include in the preamble recognition that Australia has an Indigenous heritage, a British foundation and an immigrant character was something I could have supported. And I think most people would feel the same way because it's true and it doesn't create new rights or amplify divisions based on the colour of a person's skin. But change in this area can't be something that would inevitably make some Australians more equal than others, or something that would create two classes of citizen, one class where people vote once for a national parliament and another class where they get to vote again for their own special body to advise that same parliament that they previously elected with everybody else to advise them and to direct them. And that's the problem with the whole concept of an Indigenous voice, as first demanded in the Uluru Statement from the Heart and subsequently pushed by Ken Wyatt. An advisory body, sure, fine. There's plenty of those. And they can be set up tomorrow. But something that's in legislation or, as originally dreamt up, entrenched in the Constitution, no way. I don't support that. And nor do I believe do a majority of Australians. Indeed, Ken Wyatt himself has belled the cat here. He said he won't be putting up a referendum to enshrine this Indigenous voice in the Constitution because he says, and I agree with him, the majority of Australians would not support it. So hang on. If it's a no-go as a referendum because he and the PM acknowledge voters wouldn't back it, how can the government then try and ram it through the Parliament and tell us that's democracy? Isn't that kind of patronising elitism the kind of democratic deficit that's at the heart of the mistrust people have for politicians? I don't doubt for a moment that the Parliament might be persuaded, particularly with the Greens and Labor, to support some kind of elected Indigenous representative body, a reborn ATSIC that was so discredited, I remind people, it was abolished by John Howard. But this idea of a new body that ranks us, not by our skin colour, by our skin colour, is not something that any sensible centre-right government should ever propose. Because if Aboriginal people deserve their own special body on account of being the first Australians who were historically discriminated against, what about all the other minorities that have had a difficult time in our history, like women, like migrants, like gays and lesbians, like people with a disability? Without a doubt, the best way to ensure that particular groups of people have a voice in the Parliament is not to pigeonhole them in a special body, but to actually elect them to the Parliament itself. Today, the very fact that we have more Aboriginal people in the Parliament than ever before, at least 4, Wyatt, Pat Dodson, Linda Burney and Malandiri McCarthy, shows that the system works. It's a system that unites us, it doesn't divide us. Particularly when you acknowledge that all of these Indigenous MPs were elected by the breadth of the Australian electorate and not just a narrow lobby of an electoral roll of black-only voters. As someone on the committee has said to me, we need to do this because if we don't, they'll keep pushing for a treaty. This will keep them at bay. No, it won't. And it never will. Because the moment we divide any Australian into them and us, we entrench divisions even further. Now is a time in our history to break down divisions, not create them. I guarantee you, Scott Morrison, you will rue the day if this idea ends up in legislation. Because your quiet Australians might be quiet, but they are certainly not stupid, nor are they racist. And this is what this is.